Hi there, welcome to Race Centre. I'm Dazza. Here we have an Aprilia Dorsorduro 1200. This one is a 2013 model. And if you have one of these bikes, you absolutely need to know about the things we're going to talk about in this video. These bikes, believe it or not, open the throttles without you asking for it. So you heard me right, they open the throttle plates will open even if you don't move your hand simply by the RPMs changing in the bike. Now this happens on a lot of ride-by-wire bikes, and I'll talk a little bit later about why that happens and what the concept is behind that. And these are what's called the torque demand ECU. But I can tell you, in the real world, the riding experience, it's just not what it should be. The power delivery isn't the way it should be. While these things have oodles of power, and if you've ridden one, you might know that, you know, initially you have a little bit of throttle and then they deliver heaps of power, heaps of mid-range. They go really hard, right? But the thing about it is that often the bike's actually opening the throttles more than you're asking for. So long term, when you're trying to ride it around and be smooth with the throttle, they're actually quite difficult. So I'm going to show you a graph here, and this is real. We've tapped into the ECU, we're monitoring the actual throttle opening, we're monitoring the twist grip, so what my hand's actually doing. You'll see across the top that my hand is staying completely stable. So I'm just doing a few partial and mid-range runs where I'm just holding a little bit of throttle, say 30% twist grip, opening it there. The throttles start off nice and low, and then they all of a sudden have a bit of a surge, and then they continue to rise as the RPM rises. Now, as I said, I'll explain a little bit later to why they're doing that and why the engineers have designed that in the ECU. It's become a lot more common. Obviously, one's a bit older, but still it's become more and more common with these torque demand ECUs. But essentially what is happening is that as the RPM's rising, the throttles start opening by themselves, even if your hand doesn't change. What I liken that to, and where this is, like if you were to think about it in a different way, say let's apply the same logic to the brake lever. That at 60 kilometers an hour, I'm riding along, I press a little bit of brake pressure, I get a certain amount of brake pressure, a little bit more, and I get a little bit more. And the brake works like a normal brake lever or brake pressure would work as I'd expect it to as a rider. Next, let's say we're doing 120 kilometers instead of 60. And because the speed is different, now the way the brake operates is different to how it operated at 60. So I still get my little bit of brake pressure, I can get a little bit of that, but as soon as I go for a little bit more, all of a sudden it gives me a massive burst of brake pressure. But that's not what I wanted. I only wanted a little bit more. But because it's going faster, the ECU is saying, hey, you're going faster, so even if you want a little bit of brake, I'm going to give you a heap more because you must want more because our speed's up. But that's not right. That is exactly what's happening with the throttles. So if I get a situation where if the throttles were exactly how they're meant to be and how they are after we do our NJ84 remap into the ECU, so we fix all this up with the ECU remaps that we do. If it worked properly, there's situations where I might start accelerating, pluck a couple of gears. I open the throttle, a bit through the mid-range and it's accelerating, but I know coming up I'm going to want to slow down or just hold a constant speed. So I don't keep rolling the throttle. I just open it a bit, pluck a couple of gears, then I just rest on the throttle and I'm expecting the bike just to hold its speed and not really accelerate. That can be a common thing that we do in the real world when we're riding. With this bike, how it is standard, how the ECU is programmed standard, how this torque demand works, you can't really do that. In the same situation, if you were to accelerate and you're just wanting to hold or manage that throttle, because the RPMs also rose, the throttles start opening by themselves without you even moving your hand. So it's like someone's coming along and saying you're wanting to do that, and then they grab your hand and start pulling it to open the throttle more. So when that happens, you have to shut because it's opening more than you want. And that works out to being this situation in the real world where you're constantly on and off the throttle because you're just wanting a little bit, but it's giving you a heap. So you've got to manage it. What we do with our NJ84 throttle maps is we completely correct that. So if you look at this graph here, this is after our NJ84 remap of the ECU. So we completely remap the torque demand in the ECU. And what happens is the throttles just respect what your hand's doing. Simple as that. So if you do that same situation where you roll the throttle on and then you just hold it, it'll just hold it until you go, you know what, I do want more. So if you open it more, it will open more. Now the thing about this, don't think that because we're getting rid of that phenomenon where it's opening the throttles by itself as the revs rise, that you're losing power. You're not. The power's still there. You just have to open the throttle. It's just that you're in charge. So if we look at, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this graph here, which is power, showing power of the same throttle traces that we showed you with the standard ECU map and then our NJ84 remap. So if you look at those throttle traces, now I'm going to show you the power graph of those. When you look at it, as I said, it's obvious that because the throttles aren't opening by themselves and the hand is staying the same, and they're only partial throttle openings, that the power that the dyno's reading with our NJ84 remap in the same throttle position is significantly less, right? That doesn't mean the power's not there. The power is there. You just open the throttle more and you'll get it. The problem with how it is standard, you don't have the option to get the little bit of throttle when you're in those higher RPM. You simply can't. Because the way it's mapped is that even if you're just going, say, 30% throttle at, 7,000, that type of RPM, it's going to give you like 60% throttle, even though you don't want that, because that's not what you've requested. You've opened the throttle a certain amount, and because the revs are high, it's going to give you a burst of power. So all that just nice, lovely, partial throttle, little bit of power if you're going through corners, or you're just starting to open the throttle and you just want a little bit, depending on the RPM, you can't get it standard. They've taken it away from you because the ECU will open the throttles more than you want because that's how it's been programmed. So you need to understand that with these Dorsoduros, and absolutely highly recommend getting rid of that, because when you turn them into proper linear throttle, it's so much more enjoyable to ride, and you have all the peak power and all the mid-range and all that burst of power that is their standard. You still have all of that, but you also have all the small stuff and all the power delivery that leads up to that. When we look at dyno graph, it's important to understand that when we see a graph, we're only seeing one run. If you can imagine that all the different throttle applications you do with your hand, you would see all sorts of different power runs. And that's what we feel in the real world. That's what power delivery is that we're actually modulating that with our hands, and that makes it so much more fun to ride. Same way with the brake. You can modulate the brake pressure you want. That's part of riding. That's the enjoyment of what we do. When the ECU is not respecting what your hand's doing and it's doing other things like opening the throttles more than you want, you miss out on a lot of the power delivery and a lot of the power range, if you like, that the engine can produce. So once that's all corrected, the difference is night and day. Completely different motorbike to ride. You have complete control over the power, so it's much smoother to ride. Still exhilarating. If you want all that power, so all you have to do is go like that. You just got to punch it and it will deliver it. Don't worry about that. But what we're doing is, if you only want a bit, it just gives you a bit. So much more control. So on that, NJ84 power and torque remap in these bikes is an absolute must. Transforms the bike. On top of that, we've also done a beautiful fuel tune on this one. This one's got a 3/4 system. It's got standard headers, but an arrow collector and slip-ons, and it's come up beautifully. We did an individual cylinder tune on this bike with our wideband O2 sensors in each header. These bikes do benefit from an individual cylinder tune rather than just an offset tune where you're tuning, just taking one AFR sample from both cylinders together. We do it individually, and they do benefit, produce a bit more power, but also a fair bit more mid-range throttle response and power delivery. At peak power, we haven't made a lot of power from what it was standard, because the fueling standard isn't too bad at 100% throttle. So it's only a little bit more, but throughout the mid-range, all the fueling is so much better that the roll-on, so roll-on throttle, power delivery, all of that mid-range is so much stronger and better. And then on top of that, you've got the NJ84 Throttle Maps, so you've just got so much more control and just completely transforms the power delivery of these bikes and allows you to enjoy what is, after all, an awesome engine. It's just that you don't get to access it all standard. So that's what we do there. I'm gonna just maybe explain it a little bit, because some people might be going, well, why on earth would they do that standard? Torque demand is a thing that is very common in fuel injection, particularly in cars, but also in motorcycles, where the engineers are actually designing torque graphs rather than throttle maps. So what that means, if I'm going to show you that, we're going to go to that same example that we looked at earlier, where we've got our NJ84 throttle traces and the standard. Now we're going to look at the measured rear wheel torque of those. So now, if we put them up, what you can see is that the OEM standard torque maps, the torque line is quite linear. So it's linear torque. Whereas with the NJ84, you can see that the torque drops away substantially as the RPM rise. So when you look at it on this graph, you might go, well, it's heaps better to have the original way where you've got these flat torque lines. So I've just got flat instant torque whenever I want it, right? That is a theory that might look good on paper and on a computer, but in the real world it doesn't work. And we'll explain a little bit more about why, what torque is in a little bit. But the reality is the engineers are trying to design you a linear torque map, so that depending on how much you open the twist grip, rather than the throttles opening and respecting your hand, what's actually happening is that the torque, the flat lines, just rise up, if that makes sense. So the torque rises up. And that's what the torque demand's about, and that's why they're designed that way. And if you're just sitting there, you might go, oh, eureka, that sounds great. Let's have flat torque lines so that every time I twist the throttle, I'm just getting a higher level of flat torque line. The reason it doesn't work in the real world is because torque and power are related, but they change exponentially with RPM. So as the RPM goes up, the same amount of torque. So if we look at one of these torque graphs, if we take, a particular, area where we've got, at 100% throttle, we've got, for example, like at around 4,500 RPM, we might have, 40, 50, type horsepower. Then when we go to, 9,000 RPM, it's the same amount of torque. So around the 90, 95 mark of Newton meters of torque. So it's the same torque, but the power is significantly more because of the RPM. The reason for that is that, so now we'll talk about torque versus power. And depending on, hopefully explain this in a way where it's not too confusing. But what you feel as a rider is you actually feel the power. So power is what you feel. Even if you've got a bike like this one that's got low down power, we might describe it as a torquey engine. And it is, it's a high torque engine. But what you ultimately feel is the end result, which is the power that you're getting. So I'm going to use this analogy. If you can imagine a crankshaft with, pistons sitting on it, and let's imagine there's really, really heavy, massive big pistons, like say in a massive diesel engine. What torque is, so if that's all heavy and it's stationary, you're not getting any power, there's no acceleration. What torque is would be the strength of, say you had to manually crank that thing over by hand, right? And it was this big engine with a lot of resistance initially and compression in the cylinders. Turning it over by hand would be really hard. So if you've got really thin arms, you don't go to the gym and that sort of stuff, you will find that difficult. Whereas if you get someone who's really strong, massive biceps and all that stuff, and they can turn it over a lot easier, initially they'll be able to turn it easier, right? So that's what torque is. Like, how strong is the action that's going to be able to turn it? That's what torque is. But if we can take that example then, that we've finally got those pistons moving, and then now we're spinning them, they're revving at 10,000 RPM, so they're flying, they're absolutely flying. To keep it going at that speed, I no longer have to apply that massive torque that I had to get it started. Just occasionally give it a bit of a tap, and it will stay there. I hope that makes a little bit of sense with the difference between torque and power. So that's what the torque is how much I have to physically, rotate that engine. What you feel as the rider is the output of the power that engine's turning over. So if it's going at 10,000 RPM, right, and it's got all that weight and it's mechanically moving, got all that momentum, you as the rider will be accelerating, you'll be flying down the road. That's what you feel. You don't really feel how much the arm is having to keep it there. So there's a difference between torque and power. So when it comes down to torque demand, they're trying to get a flat torque line as the RPMs rise. You actually don't want that. Because if you have linear torque as the RPM rises, you're accelerating. So if you just hold the throttle and you don't want to accelerate, you'll hold the throttle. But because of the way the torque demand is, it'll keep accelerating because they're trying to get a flat torque line. And it's fundamentally a flawed concept. Now, it happens a lot in bikes and, as I said, cars. This one is an extreme version. They're not normally this bad. They raise a bit. These raise a lot, and it's designed that way so you get a flat torque line, which is, like I said, good on a piece of paper, but real world, no thanks. The difference is huge when you get control back, that if you want more acceleration, you want more power, you just ask for it. It'll deliver it. But if you don't want it, you're going to hold the throttle there, and it should respect what you've asked. There is no situation where a motorcycle in the real world should be opening the throttles by itself. If you want to do that, you can do that. In racing, in the racing world, the racing industry, they do use things like that where the throttles are behaving differently depending on the RPM, corner, gear. But they also have electronics engineers working with the rider constantly. You don't have that on the road when you're riding the motorcycle by yourself. So really, really important to get that done, get those throttles fixed up, and then the power delivery and the bike is just so much better to ride. So hopefully that all makes sense. And yeah, time to have a listen.